Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com, setting the record straight about climate. Every time I go to the NASA Goddard Institute for Space Studies website, I'm always impressed with the level of propaganda and complete nonsense on display there. There's very little information about space on the Institute for Space Studies website, and it consists almost entirely of global warming propaganda. And their propaganda always consists of very confident-sounding authoritarian statements. Statements like this one: neighborhoods on New York City's Queens and Brooklyn shorelines will see more frequent nuisance flooding as sea levels rise due to climate change. Note that they say it will happen and it's due to climate change. The author expresses no doubt and no uncertainty. Richard Feynman, the great American physicist and Nobel Prize winner, said, "If you thought science was certain, well, that was just an error on your part." The reality is that there's no indication that sea level rise rates have changed in New York. This is the official tide gauge for Lower Manhattan from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. The tide gauge is located just a few miles away from the Goddard Institute for Space Studies headquarters. It shows a steady rate of sea level rise and no indication that the rate has changed over time. When atmospheric CO2 is 300 parts per million, the sea level rise rate at Lower Manhattan was about 2.85 millimeters per year. And it's the same story when carbon dioxide levels were 310 parts per million, and again at 350 parts per million, and the same story at 400 parts per million CO2. There's no indication that atmospheric CO2 levels have any effect on sea level rise rates at Lower Manhattan. If we were somehow magically able to reduce CO2 levels back to 300 parts per million, sea level at Lower Manhattan would still be rising at the same rate of 2.85 millimeters per year. There's nothing humans can do to control the rise of the seas. Superstitious people have always believed that government can control the rise of the oceans. 1,000 years ago, King Canute had to take his subjects down to the seashore to demonstrate to them that he had no control over the seas. The superstition that the government can control sea level still pervades society 1,000 years later. If we go back even further, 20,000 years ago sea level was 120 meters or 400 feet lower than it is now. Manhattan was buried under more than a mile of ice at that time. Then the ice melted and sea level rose 400 feet. NASA wants you to believe that 400 feet of sea level rise was natural, but the last couple of inches are man-made. And the reality is that most of the sea level rise which we appear to be seeing at Lower Manhattan is actually due to the land sinking. There is no scientific justification for NASA's authoritative statements about New York City flooding. They're simply spreading fear-mongering propaganda and destroying NASA's good name in the process. NASA's James Hansen is the guy who started the global warming scare before Congress in 1988. At that time, he predicted that the West Side Highway along the Hudson River in Manhattan would be underwater within 20 or 30 years. According to Hansen, the West Side Highway should have been underwater no later than last year. Well, this is how the West Side Highway looks this morning. I'm guessing that those are not U-boats and that Hansen was wrong with his forecasts. Here's another feature on the NASA Climate Propaganda website. Earth's fresh water is moving. Some places are getting much drier, which leaves areas like the American West exposed to fires burning hotter and longer. The words imply that the American West is getting much drier. Let's look at the actual data. This is the official precipitation graph for the western U.S. from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. The blue line is the trend line, and you can see that the western United States has gotten wetter since the 19th century. The graph shows that there was a very bad drought around 1930, another one in 1977, and another bad drought during 2001 and 2002. But the overall precipitation trend for the western U.S. is upwards. California's three best ski seasons were in 2011, 2017, and this past year. Here in the Rocky Mountain states, we've had 7 consecutive relatively quiet fire years. According to the U.S. Forest Service, forest fire burn acreage in the United States is down 80% since the 1930s. So once again, almost everything being claimed on this NASA webpage is incorrect. And they make these claims with such great authority. People tend to think of NASA as being the agency which took us to the moon. But many of the people who did go to the moon are hopping mad about all this climate junk science coming out of NASA. 49 former NASA scientists, engineers, and astronauts sent a letter to the NASA administrator in 2012 blasting their global warming stance. Is NASA playing fast and loose with climate change science? That's the contention of a group of 49 former NASA scientists and astronauts. On March 28, 2012, the group sent a letter to the NASA administrator, blasting the agency for making unwarranted claims about the role of carbon dioxide in global warming. Here is a quote from the letter. "We believe the claims by NASA and the Goddard Institute for Space Studies that man-made carbon dioxide is having a catastrophic impact on climate change are not substantiated, especially when considering thousands of years of empirical data," the group wrote. With hundreds of well-known climate scientists and tens of thousands of other scientists publicly declaring their disbelief in the catastrophic forecasts, coming particularly from the GIST leadership, it is clear that the science is not settled. At the time, the GIST leadership was NASA's James Hansen, the guy who predicted that lower Manhattan would be underwater by now. The president at the time was Barack Obama, and he chose to ignore the people who went to the moon and instead accused them of being the Flat Earth Society. Barack Obama, who has no background in science, called the people who took this picture the Flat Earth Society. And that is a pretty stunning indication of the level of decadence which climate alarmists have obtained. Visit Toto on the web at realclimatescience.com. He's been pulling back the curtain on junk science and propaganda for a long time.